Today I recorded myself doing some unit testing on some code I wrote. The code deals with separating stacks of the application from the I/O that the code needs to get at. And so in this, I describe how I do some of that separation, how I set up my mocking layer, how I set up the test so that I can get the business logic located in one place and leave a really thin mock underneath. You see also I make a lot of mistakes while I code. It's just what happens. And you see some of the ways that my testing that I wrote protects me against my own mistakes. Believe it or not, dev testing actually does something. It actually catches bugs. And in my case, it corrects what I'm doing quite a lot. So let's go ahead and take a look. The key ideas to focus on here are how I move business logic into the layer that's being tested and isolate I/O into the thinnest amount possible so that we can deal with that in less code and cover the real harder problems inside of something we control with the unit test. All right, thanks. Let's go take a look. So right now, I am working on the test for a method called getIssueReport. And the idea is that if you've already reported an issue, you want to be able to retrieve it from the system. Okay, and there's an expected interface on this that I wrote from an in-memory provider, which was really just there to stub out testing and to stub out the main logic of a repository. But now the embedding issue provider has the same thing. So we're going to write the test for getIssueReport, and I'll show how I layer up the I/O specific things that keep the business logic of the embedding issue provider separate from the I/O implementations. So the first thing I'm going to do is I like to layer my tests, and I'm using jest, and so just use this describe in a hierarchical form to name the test based on the levels of describe that you're adding. So the embedding issue provider is what I'm working on. GetIssueReport is what I have here, and I'm just going to say existing issue and just call it that. Okay, and get the semicolon at the end. So we're going to give this a body. Okay, and this now becomes a specific test, right? And so now we've got to provide a body for the test. So the API expects a couple of things. It expects us to have an issue database, and it expects us to have an embedding provider, not issue provider, provider. And these are the ones that would talk to the specific database technology, the specific embedding model, and the specific vector database. So the embedding provider is the one that talks to the embedding model and the vector database. So I am going to borrow an object here. I'm calling it embeddings maker because I am dreadful at naming things. But the standard interface the way this is working is everything comes through an object that exposes an interface called getIssueProvider, right? And so we see that likewise in repository as well, that it uses getIssueProvider to find the issue provider when it needs it. I don't. That shows up in my unit tests elsewhere. I haven't put in the top level code that does this, not inside repository. The definition of the REST API is where that happens. But going back into this, we expose this getIssueProvider to get back the issue provider. Likewise for the issue database equals mock issue database dot get database. Okay, and then the I'm sorry, I called that wrong. got this all backwards too. It's because I'm trying to talk while I do this. Let's go embedding provider equals mock embedding provider dot get embedding provider. Okay, so the deal is these two mocks are mocking out what would normally attach to the IO. You know, call out to wherever we're getting the embeddings from, call out to the vector database in this first one. So I'm isolating IO here, and then here, and the database, whether that's SQL, Postgres, or MySQL, or something else, Azure Tables, whatever. But when you create this issue provider, the embeddings one, it wants the embeddings provider and the issue database. Got this expansion in there. Okay, so that's what we're going to do there. Now, at this point, we're going to start to define the contract expectations. So what is the relationship between get issue provider's get issue report call and the underlying IO objects, right? There's a contract relationship that we're establishing in the design now. And what I'm saying is that issue database dot, and I am going to say get issue report, and equals a function. So I'm actually defining this now. I mean, I know what I want it to be. It's not as if I'm just like totally making this up as I go, because I've thought this out a bit. But it is basically, we're saying we're going to pass it. I use this kind of shorthand when I'm doing the mocks. I use a more full description when I actually write up the real method. But we're going to pass it an ID of a tenant, an ID of a project, and an ID for the report. Okay, and what it is going to return is actually going to be an array. And the reason I'm doing this as an array is because the object that we're talking about here is acting as if it's connecting to a database. Okay, and the notion of seeing something that isn't there in a database, which could happen, and I know I'm jumping ahead in this sort of TDD dogma, you're supposed to do one thing at a time, but I don't like doing stuff that I have to completely redesign the behaviors. But within a database, when something's not there, you tend to get empty result sets, right? Whereas the API that we're calling, I'm expecting it to throw when something's not there. But that's not what's going to happen on the database level. And so I'm making the throw logic, which we'll get to that eventually, as part of the get issue report business logic in the issue provider, not in the underlying IO object. Right, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, but that's one of the reasons I'm doing a return. And now we're going to just, I have issue report defined in the schema already, which is nice. I'm just going to use some really generic values here because, and let's just call it 100 for lack of anything else. So this is what we're returning. So we're saying the underlying object is going to call this. We can take a look at, has this been defined already? No, okay, so the issue database has not defined that yet. I'm going to show you something that I like to do with these. I'm going to do, you see, I already did this with get issue profile. And I'm going to do this with get issue report. When I write my mocks, and there's all sorts of mocking frameworks that make this easier. I tend to be explicit with my mocks. I'm also being lazy here. I'm reusing this literal. I should just borrow it somewhere else. Actually, my lack of familiarity with JavaScript shows a little bit here. There's better ways to throw than this, but this is what I'm doing at the moment. I'll probably clean myself up later. But basically, I'm just throwing this non-implemented. So I like to, in the mock, throw the mock version of the method. That way, if the code winds up calling it in an unexpected situation, we get an error. Okay, this is the way I like to design my mocks, and a lot of mock frameworks will actually implement mocks for you that do something similar to this. Uh, JavaScript will tend to also just say your method's not defined, right? So that's another way of catching it. But I like to very intentionally say I really want to know that this mock is going to throw if this gets called in a case where I don't want it to. In this case, I want it to, so I'm defining the actual implementation here. Okay, min date, I just put it up and define that up here for convenience. That way I know I'm always looking at this lowest possible date. Okay, now that I've got all of this behavior defined, I'm going to say, let's just get a result equals, what would we call that? Issue provider. I make so many mistakes when I do this kind of thing as I go. Let's go tenant 1, project 1, and let's go report 1. See, it's not really very interesting. And then we're going to say expect, which is how Jest does its final checking, and to equal. And actually, let's get specific. So let's go dot report ID. I do believe that is the yeah. So following to the definition, report ID is the property that we want. So say to equal, and we'll just say report 1. And I'm going to keep this really thin for right now, because I could also check that the message is test message. I could check that the date is min date. At the moment, I just want to check this because this should fail right now because I've done nothing with it. So let's take a look at what is going wrong. When I threw it, it says argument must not be null. That doesn't seem like it is the right reason to fail. It should be failing for other reasons. But let's take a look. Embeddings issued unit test 7879. Thrown argument must not be null. Get issue provider. Oh, okay. So no. That is. And yeah, I issue provider. It should be issue database. That's what I did. I'll tell you, JavaScript. You get to watch me make dumb mistakes while I'm working. I don't know how many other people live through this with JavaScript. Maybe all the time. Okay, great. Now we are down to something I actually expected, which is not implemented, which suggests that we got here. Indeed, yes. Throw not implemented. Excellent. That is where we should be. And that's right. So first off, this now, as they say, write it so it fails, and then fix it until it doesn't. And so now we know that calling this with it not working, if it fails, the test will say, hey, that failed, right? Because we got an error thrown. Let's at least get it to stop throwing that error, right? We could just return new common schema dot issue. IntelliSense, why do you hate me? Because I fat fingered it. Okay, dot issue report, and get the arguments back up there. Oh, come on. Fine, we'll just leave it like that. See what it does with that. Actually, I think it's going to give me an error for that as well, because the code is saying it's going to, the issue report, and that should, yeah, issue report is not a constructor. It should be like that, issue report. That's why it wasn't giving me the IntelliSense. Let's do this. Let's do now, and let's do this. Okay. So I'm just giving back one with blank values because I also want to make sure the test code does fail on the check, right? Because that expect should say I'm looking for this and I see something else. And so I want to watch that happen. So yeah, here we go. The failure is report 1 and blah, like that. Okay, so now I am going to actually do what we're supposed to, which is this dot issue database dot get issue report, and we pass in the tenant ID, project ID, and the report ID. But actually, like I said, I want this to this is actually, well, I'll go through this. I'll go through this in this thing. It's going to force me to rewrite a test, but let me show you what I mean by this. So let's run this now and see if it works. Because what it's doing is it's calling the database and saying, give me get issue report. And if I wired up the test correctly, yeah, so it wound up with undefined. So that probably, at this point, that probably means the test did the wrong thing. Maybe, I don't know. Result.report ID to be report 1. No, that should. Oh, you know what? Issue report is, yeah, I gave it 100, but I passed in that, and I'm confusing myself with that. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to change it to, even though I passed in report 1, I'm going to change it to 100, because what I'm saying is like I'm telling the provider to trust the underlying IO gizmo provider to give you the ID. And you never know. Maybe the ID that you asked for is different than the ID that comes back based on the database implementation. I don't know, but we're saying trust that ID by doing it this way. I'm gonna save this because the Test Explorer only runs the saved version, not the most current version. I think this one's going to work now. Actually, no. We're still doing undefined, which doesn't make much sense to me. Issue report ID, any 100. Yeah, that still is wrong. My logic was why it was failing was wrong. Let's go to 12. So report ID takes in, if there's not null, it assigns it to a report ID, right? So we should be good there. I'm trying to do this without stepping it. Get issue report there. Let's look at the implementation again. This database.get issue report. It's returning that. That should be fine. See, now okay. I implemented it this way anyway. So you see, all right, fine. I'll just jump ahead. So I implemented it returning an array, but I acted as if it was not, because I was going to show you guys sort of how to progressively step through this, but that's okay. Let's just nail this now. So given that is how it works, what I need to do is cut this from here. Equals that, boom. If I'm already getting down to Actually, let's not put that. Let's not put that in yet. We'll see how that. Let's keep this very TDD. So I'm just going to return the first of these. Okay, and that should work right now. It'll make this test work, and let's see what happens. So, because the underlying IO provider returns an array of objects as if it's like a database, and this guy returns the first of those. Okay, so now this is passing. So now we're in line with the contract as defined by the mock. It's as if I'm letting the mock. Well, I am. I'm using the mock to state my contract. Okay, and so now this code has to comply with the mock. So there we go. We've got a test that handles that case. But let's create the case where there is no issue profile, no, or issue report, no existing report. So instead of returning this, we're going to return that. Okay, we're going to return an empty array. Okay, so no existing report. And now we're going to say, instead of being able to check it at all, we are going to say expect that a function, and I'll get to that in a second. We'll move that into the body, throws to throw, and now we've got a fun thing we got to do, because we're going to create a new exception. And this goes back to me. Issue report does not exist, I should call it. This is report. Notice that I'm putting the exception in the embedding issue provider, the higher up object, not down in the item that talks to the database, because I don't want database level errors to be what bubbles up to the consumer of the API. I want to own the meaning of it, and the way you own the meaning of it is by defining an exception in your interface. You say, these are the exceptions this interface throws. Okay, so that's what I've put there, right? And so now I'm saying expect to throw embeddings maker dot. Oh, and I've got to export it too. Okay, and let's say dot issue report does not exist. Boom. So now we're expecting that will throw, and now let's take the call that we were making outside that and then put it inside here. I like a space there. So now what this is saying is that when we make this call and the item does not exist, in other words, when the underlying provider returns an empty array, we expect the API to throw with this explicit throw. And so this ought to fail. Let's run this level here again, because it's not throwing yet. It's just returning the 0th item, which there won't be a 0th item. It's probably going to get if it runs at all, it's going to probably get an indexing error or something. Function did not throw. It just didn't throw. This is one of the things like JavaScript bugs me. It's like any other language, try to get the 0th item out of an empty array, you're gonna get an out of array bounds error. This thing apparently did that, and just came back. So it's a good thing that we do these checks, because that would have just flown by at runtime with God knows what. So let's go in and now let's implement the failure. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to say if results.length equals 0, probably better checks for this, throw issue profile, issue report does not exist. Okay, and now let's run this test, this check, this test. And there we go. We are failing for the reason with the explanation, right? And we're failing up here in response to what's a normal database condition, which is to return an empty row set. And we're saying we're interpreting that as an error, right? You shouldn't have asked for a thing that doesn't exist, okay? And we're making it meaningful in our context instead of people guessing about errors that are happening down inside of a service level. So that's the idea there. So we're owning it. Okay. Now I want to introduce another example of error here. So I'm going to take this block. I'm going to put in 3, 1, 2. No. Okay. And let me show you some changes I'm going to do here. So now I'm going to say null tenant. So in case someone passes in a null value for the tenant or the project or the report, I want to get a test for each one of those. I'm going to start this with the tenant. So the first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to remove this implementation because I don't want it calling the underlying provider at all if the tenant is null. Right, so I'm going to guard that with this, so that, and that's why there is the not implemented on the mock, so that when it tries to call it, it'll say, hey, I'm not implemented. What are you calling me for? So right away, we're enforcing some of the contract behavior by saying, if any of these arguments are invalid, we don't want you calling the provider underneath. Okay, so let's do that. And now, before I do that, I'm going to take out this expectation because we're not going to check any return values. We're just going to wrap this in and I have this null argument exception, and there's probably a generic one that is everyone uses in JavaScript, and this is just me not knowing JavaScript as well as someone who's done it a lot, but this still works, just probably a better way to do it. Anyway, here I have my null tenant one, and now it's in the form that I want, which is to say I'm going to expect that this should throw with null argument. I'm just going to expect the same for each one. But here's the thing with testing. When you're testing things like arguments that are invalid that should throw an error, you need a test for each one of them, because the one being invalid can block you even evaluating the other, and it's easy to have mistakes that way. So I'm going to copy this 3 times, one for each, right? Because they wind up being exclusive of each other. So I'm going to take one of these and change it project, take one of these and change it to report. Okay, a little sloppy in my names there. It should be tenant ID, project ID, report ID, but we're good. And now I'm just going to null this, and I am going to null that, and I'm going to null that. Okay, right? And let's save that. Let's run the node. And when we run the node, we should get 3 new tests that come up: null project, null report, null tenant. And if we run each of those, they should all fail. Probably going to throw the not implemented exception, but let's see. Not implemented, not implemented, not implemented. Good. Okay, let's go. The first one was null tenant, and let's just go in here. I'm going to nail all 3 at once. So we're just going to do an upfront check before we do anything else. If tenant ID equals null, project ID equals null, report ID equals null, throw common schema.null. So that same exception I was expecting earlier. And now I'm going to run the whole thing here because I'm looking at the entry condition to the whole function. So I really should check all that I've got so far to make sure I didn't regress anything with that. So let's run that. I mean, I can do everything in the whole set of tests that I have, but I'm really just nothing else is calling this method yet because I'm just implementing it now. So it's isolated, and that indeed came back and failed the way we wanted it to. And so I want to reiterate something I said before. I am putting the business logic of what I define as errors into the provider that is abstracted away from the IO. Okay. I am putting in all of the logic about that I'm getting the first one off the set, which this method, that's all it wants to do. And that I'm dealing with a database return, so I've got to know which one to get. That's all business logic. That it doesn't matter what the underlying implementation is as long as they conform to the expectations of this. The idea of putting the business logic here is it makes the IO layer thin. I want very, very little logic happening in it, only enough to construct a query and get the data back. And all the thinking of the objects, I try to put in a layer where I can isolate the testing of this business logic with a set of tests that look for, are you doing what I expect you to do? And I can confirm that here, look for regressions here where it's fast, happens in memory. I don't need connections to databases or live services or any file IO or anything across the network. All of it can happen in memory as fast as possible, and that's why I'm doing it this way. Okay, that is what I wanted to implement for right now. So I'm going to submit these changes, and thank you.